"Sir, this section is for designated family only. Step back or security will escort you." That's what they told him. He didn't argue. He just stood there in his old Marine jacket holding the invitation his son wrote by hand. "Dad, I want you in the front row." They thought he didn't belong. But 6 Navy SEALs sitting quietly in the 5th row, they knew exactly who he was. And when they stood up, everything changed. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The sun had barely crested over the ridge when Susan Langley pulled into the faculty lot of St. Albans College, nestled in the quiet folds of Albemarle County, Virginia. The sky was clear, the breeze soft, and the kind of hopeful stillness hung in the air that only ever shows up on mornings like this, graduation morning. She smoothed the creases in her dress before stepping out of her car. Clutched tightly in her hand was a program with her son's name printed halfway down the second column, Dean's List. It read, she'd stared at those 2 words at least 100 times in the last 2 weeks, each time with a strange swelling pride that had nowhere to go but her chest. The auditorium was already humming by the time she entered, families with signs, balloons, bouquets. The air buzzed with chatter and camera flashes. Susan followed the usher's handwave to her seat, 5th row from the front, center left. She liked having a clear view of the stage. She liked seeing the students line up, caps tilted, shoulders squared, but even more than that, she liked watching the crowd. That's when she saw him. He didn't come through the main entrance like the rest of them. He emerged from the far side door near the emergency exit, quiet, deliberate, alone. He wore an old Marine dress jacket, the kind Susan remembered from her father's funeral, faded at the seams, a size too large in the shoulders. His jeans were worn, boots scuffed, his hands stayed folded behind his back. And though the rest of the crowd was still in motion, chatting, laughing, adjusting ties, he stood completely still, like a statue no one asked for and no one could ignore. Susan tilted her head slightly. The man didn't look lost. He looked patient, watchful, like he was waiting for something. Eventually, he moved slowly, carefully toward the front rows. He approached the roped-off section, the one with the little silver placards and printed name tags. "Guest of honor," they read. He stepped up to an empty seat near the aisle, and then came the girl in the headset. "Sir," she said, blocking his path, clipboard tight to her chest, "this section is for designated family only." The man nodded once, calm. "My son's graduating today. I should be on the list." She didn't check, didn't look, just pointed toward the back. "You'll need to stand clear, please, or security will escort you." Susan watched as the man's posture didn't change. Not a twitch, not a flinch. He simply stepped back. 1 pace, no resistance, no argument. 2 security guards moved closer, hovering just behind the usher. The crowd didn't notice, not really. They were too busy adjusting camera angles and fixing corsages. But Susan noticed, and so did a small group of men in row 5, just a few seats to her right. Their eyes hadn't left the man since he entered. The old Marine took a position by the side wall just beneath the glowing red exit sign, hands still behind his back, chin lifted slightly, his gaze locked on the stage. The ceremony began not long after. A booming voice over the speakers welcomed students, parents, and honored guests. Everyone clapped. Cameras clicked. The dean made a joke about tuition. People laughed. But Susan didn't laugh. She was still watching the man at the back. The girl with the headset passed by him again, this time with another staffer. "He's still standing there," she whispered. "I don't think he's even invited. I'll have security keep an eye on him," the other replied. Susan felt her chest tighten, not from fear, not from anger, from something else. A kind of second-hand shame that didn't belong to her, but clung to her anyway, because that man, whoever he was, didn't look like trouble. He looked like someone who had already seen too much of it. Then came the student speaker, a polished young man with impeccable posture and an even better suit, the dean's son, according to the program. He spoke with all the right pauses, thanked all the right people, but then he added something else. "And a special thanks," he said with a chuckle, "to the presentable family sitting right here in the front, reminding us what real college values look like." Laughter trickled through the crowd, polite, polished. But Susan didn't laugh. Neither did the man at the back, and neither did the 3 men in row 5. They exchanged glances, quick, quiet. One of them, tall with a closely cropped haircut under a ball cap, leaned slightly forward. "That was for him," he muttered. The others gave a single, knowing nod. Susan looked back toward the stage, then toward the man by the wall. He hadn't moved. Still standing, still waiting, still holding something invisible, but unmistakably heavy. And in that moment, Susan knew two things with absolute certainty. That man didn't come here to make a scene, and someone had made a mistake. A big one, because she didn't know his name yet, didn't know where he came from, didn't know what uniform he once wore or how many nights he'd spent walking into the fire so others didn't have to. But she knew this: he didn't belong at the back of the room, not today. Not ever. And if nobody else was going to see it, then maybe it was up to her. The program shifted. One name after another was called. Applause, flashbulbs. But Susan Langley couldn't take her eyes off the man at the back of the room, the one no one else seemed to see. A few rows behind her, those three men still watched him, too. Subtle, but intent. Their posture didn't match the crowd's relaxed enthusiasm. They sat straighter, quieter, like they were waiting for something they already suspected was coming. When the ushers moved again, this time with a security clipboard in hand, Susan Langley leaned forward in her seat, her brow furrowing. The man didn't resist as one of them approached. He simply turned slightly, listening as the guard said something enough that Susan Langley couldn't hear the words, but she saw the response. The man shook his head gently, then spoke back firm, not loud. "I'm not causing trouble," he said. "My son asked me to be here. I'm not moving until I see him walk that stage." The guard stood straighter, trying to assert his position. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Susan Langley glanced around. Nobody else was paying attention. The families in the front rows were preoccupied with getting the best shot of their graduate, not noticing the quiet removal unfolding just a few feet away, except for the men in row 5 and Susan Langley. She turned slightly to the woman seated next to her, a school administrator, from the look of her name badge. "Do you know who that wand is?" she asked quietly. The woman looked up from her program, indifferent. Probably someone who wandered into the wrong section. These ceremonies always bring in extras. The word hit Susan harder than she expected. Like this man, this statue of dignity and scuffed boots was just clutter. She looked back, and for the first time she really saw him. The lines in his face, the rigid set of his jaw, the way his left shoulder tilted just slightly like an old injury still bore weight even after years. And the jacket, dark blue, brass buttons dulled by time, sleeves frayed at the edges. It wasn't for show, it was the best thing he had. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but she knew one thing. He came prepared for this moment. Not for a confrontation, for his son. The second guard stepped in now. A hand gently touched the man's elbow, urging him toward the exit. And that's when Susan Langley heard it, faint, but unmistakable, the crinkle of paper. The man reached into the inside pocket of his marine dress coat and pulled out a small folded card. Its edges were softened from being read too many times. He held it out, not to the guard, but just in front of him, not as a weapon, as a reason. "My son sent this," he said softly, handwritten. Susan caught a glimpse of the words scrolled in blue ink. One sentence: "Dad, I want you into the front row," but that didn't matter to the staff. "No guest pass, no seat," the usher said firmly. "Please, sir." The man exhaled slowly and nodded. No resistance, just a quiet, obedient step back. Susan felt something rise in her throat. Anger, yes, but also shame, not hers, his. And the injustice of it all made her pulse quicken. She opened her mouth, ready to say something, but she didn't have to. A single chair scraped backward, then another, then 4 more. From row 5, 6 men stood up at once. They didn't speak, they didn't shout, they didn't draw attention to themselves, but in the ripple of movement, Susan felt the whole room change. The man nearest the aisle, tall, broad, eyes sharp beneath a civilian baseball cap, stepped out and walked toward the back, toward the old Marine, toward the man who was being escorted out of his own son's graduation. He reached into his jacket, pulled something small from his pocket, and held it out. Susan squinted. It looked like a badge, but not police, not military rank. It gleamed under the overhead lights, gold with silver wings, and then she saw it. The trident, United States Navy SEAL. Another man joined him, and then another. All 6 now stood beside the old Marine, not flanking him, not guarding him, backing him. The first one, the tall one, looked at the security guard and spoke in a voice that was calm, but carried like a drum beat. "That man doesn't leave this room," he said. "He led us through hell. He stays right here." Gasps whispered through the rows. Some people turned. Most still didn't understand, but Susan did. She stood slowly, her eyes locked on the old Marine, his name still unknown to her, but not his worth, because no one gets a SEAL to stand for them by accident. No one gets 6. The guards froze, looked between the men, then at the badge, then at the crowd, which was now paying attention. The usher, who had dismissed him, stepped back, eyes wide, and the old Marine. He didn't gloat, didn't lift his head in pride. He just lowered his gaze to the floor because it wasn't about vindication. It was about something. He never asked for a seat to see his son, a seat that never came. Susan turned to the woman beside him again, but this time she didn't ask. She simply said, "That man's name will mean something before this day is done." Then she stepped aside, clearing a path, because whatever happened next, she knew the auditorium had just witnessed the start of something far bigger than any program or prepared speech, something real. Something earned, and it had come from the back of the room where the best seat was never offered, but where true honor had been standing all along. The room didn't breathe. For a long moment, all you could hear was the buzz of the overhead lights and the distant shuffling of programs being tucked nervously under seats. The 6 men stood shoulder to shoulder, their civilian clothes doing nothing to hide who they were anymore. The badges in their hands caught the auditorium lighting small, shining, and unmistakable. Navy SEAL Trident. Susan didn't move, her pulse beat in her ears, but her feet stayed still. Everyone around her had turned by now. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence, phones lowered, laughter dried in the air like it never belonged there. And the man at the center of it, still unmoved, just stood there quietly, the invitation still folded in his hand, his jaw set not in anger, but restraint. The tall SEAL took a step forward. His voice when it came was low, but it filled the entire space. "You can't remove him," he said. "You won't." He paused, looking toward the crowd. "This man led us through fire, through dirt, through blood. When the world collapsed behind us, he stood up front." He turned back to the guards. "He doesn't leave this room." Nobody clapped, nobody cheered, but something shifted. It wasn't loud. It was quieter than reverence, like the room was waking up from something like shame had pulled the curtain back on its own performance. Then another voice rose, this time from the left side of the auditorium. It wasn't young, it wasn't commanding, but it carried. A man stood older, his chest dressed in military medals that shimmered beneath a gray jacket. A few heads turned, a few gasped. Susan did, too. She recognized the uniform. A colonel. "I know that man," the colonel said, voice unwavering. "His name is Master Sergeant Raymond Cole, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, United States Marine Corps, retired." He took a breath thick with memory. "In 2006, during Operation Firewatch in Kandahar, I watched that man run back into a burning compound to drag out 5 Marines under active fire. He didn't ask for backup. He didn't wait for orders, he just went." Silence fell heavier than before. He was the only one who came back outstanding. The colonel finished because he carried the rest of us on his back. A single cough echoed in the distance. Someone dropped their room, jaw their program, but still no one spoke. Susan looked at the man again. Raymond Cole, still standing, still silent, still not demanding a thing. Then a shuffle from the side of the stage, movement behind the rows of graduates. A young man in cap and gown stepped forward, his steps quick, purposeful, eyes searching the crowd, his cap tilted slightly to one side, his hands trembling as he reached for the microphone on the podium. Susan knew before anyone said a word this was the son, Lucas Cole. He didn't clear his throat, didn't wait for permission, he just leaned into the mic and spoke. "That's my dad." Every head turned toward the stage. Lucas stared down into the crowd, his voice tight with emotion, but steady. He didn't want attention. He never did. Every morning before school, for as long as I can remember, he told me the same thing. He paused, his breath caught. Then he pushed forward. stand tall, keep going. Be someone you'd be proud to look in the eye. He looked over at his father, standing by the exit door. I'm proud today, he said, but not because of this degree. Not because of this stage. Lucas stepped out from behind the podium. I'm proud because of him. The room was silent, the kind of silence you only hear in sanctuaries or in battlefields. Lucas kept walking down the steps past the rows of stunned graduates toward the back, toward the man they almost threw out. He stopped in front of his father. No hesitation. Then, in a slow practiced motion, Lucas brought his hand to his forehead and saluted. Raymond didn't return it. He stepped forward and pulled his son into his arms. Their embrace wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rehearsed, it was real, and that's why it hit harder than anything else that day. The 6 seals stood straighter, one by one, tucked on in unison. They raised their hands and saluted the man who had once led them into hell and walked them back out. Susan blinked fast, trying to clear her vision. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen a room full of people forget themselves like this. People who had laughed a few minutes ago now stood frozen, silent, respectful. And in that stillness, something holy happened, not religious but sacred. Raymond placed a hand gently on Lucas's shoulder and whispered something only his son could hear. Lucas smiled faintly, nodded, then turned, facing the crowd with his father beside him. The usher who dismissed Raymond earlier looked down at her clipboard like it had betrayed her. One of the security guards stepped back, quietly fading into the side hallway. No one tried to stop them now, no one dared. Susan watched as Lucas took his father's hand and led him forward toward the rows that once wouldn't have him toward the front. And for the first time all morning, every single person moved out of the way. Not because they were told, but because it was right. Raymond Cole didn't say a word as he walked beside his son. He didn't have to. The silence of the auditorium said enough. At first, it was still thick, the kind of stillness that only comes after something sacred has passed through a room. Then a sound soft, tentative, zo. A single pair of hands clapping, slow, steady. Then another, and another. Like a rain that starts with one drop, then swells into a flood. Soon the entire auditorium was on its feet. No whoops, no cheers, just applause, pure, grounded, reverent. Susan stood too, her hands coming together, not just in recognition, but in apology, because the man they tried to push aside had become the man no one could look away from. The usher, the one who turned him away, without a glance, stared down at the floor, clipboard trembling in her hands. She stepped aside quickly as Raymond passed. Not a word, not even a glance, just shame, folded quietly into silence. Raymond's walk to the front wasn't fast. He didn't rush. His boots hit the floor with the same steady rhythm he must have used in the field. Deliberate, unshaken, Lucas stayed by his side the whole way. When they reached the roped-off section, the same line he'd been denied entrance to earlier, no one stopped them. The same usher who'd waved him off now moved aside without meeting his eyes. This time there was no resistance, just space. Space that hadn't been given, but had now been earned. Raymond didn't gloat, didn't nod in triumph, he just sat. Second row, center left, Lucas beside him, and behind them, still standing, arms at their sides. Those 6 seals remained at attention. They didn't return to their seats. They didn't need to. Their place was behind him, not in front, not beside, behind, where they'd always been. The ceremony resumed, but the tone had changed completely. When the dean returned to the podium, he didn't speak right away. He looked toward the group, toward Raymond, and paused, visibly unsettled. His voice, when it finally came, was smaller than before. "We are honored today," he said, clearing his throat, "to welcome guests of great distinction. Some we failed to recognize soon enough." There was a pause, then a few claps, then more, so, and then again, to the room filled with sound, but it wasn't for the dean. It wasn't for the faculty. It wasn't even for the graduates. It was for a man who came with nothing but a folded card in his pocket, and the kind of dignity the world forgets how to see. Raymond didn't smile. He didn't soak in the moment. He simply unfolded the invitation one more time. Read the words his son had written. "Dad, I want you in the front row," then tucked it back into his coat pocket close to his chest because that's what he'd come for. Not a spotlight, just that seat. After the ceremony, As the crowd slowly filtered out, Susan stayed in her seat. She didn't want to leave just yet. She wanted to see what happened when the applause faded, when the lights dimmed and the decorations came down. That's when she saw something she'd never forget. One by one, students passed by Raymond's seat. Some stopped to shake his hand. Some just laid a hand briefly on his shoulder and kept walking, no words needed. One young woman, a graduate with tear-streaked cheeks, paused, saluted him, and whispered, "Thank you for carrying them." Raymond nodded gently, said nothing. Susan's throat tightened as she watched it unfold. There was no announcement, no camera crew, no prepared statement, just gratitude in its rawest, realest form. Then one of the SEALs, the youngest looking of the six, stepped forward and placed something small in Raymond's hand. A coin. Challenge coin. Susan recognized. She'd seen one once at a funeral. They weren't given lightly. Raymond turned it over in his palm. On one side, the emblem of their SEAL team. On the other, 5 engraved words. "The quiet ones lead the loudest wars." Raymond closed his hand around the coin. The man didn't cry, but Susan swore just for a second that his shoulders eased just a little, as if something heavy had been lifted. Not taken, just shared. And that mattered, and that meant everything. Later, as the room emptied and the janitorial staff moved quietly through the rows, Susan finally stood. She glanced one more time toward the man who had changed the course of an entire morning without raising his voice. He hadn't come for applause. He hadn't come to prove a point. He came because his son asked him to. Because somewhere in a world that forgets so quickly, one boy remembered. Susan turned toward the exit, her heels clicking softly on the tile. At the door, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle. Then she looked back one last time at the 6 men still standing guard, at the boy who gave up his moment for his father, and at the man who'd stood quietly at the back of the room until the whole room stood for him. And she said, not aloud but clear enough in her heart, he didn't come to demand anything, he came for a seat. But by the time he left, the whole room stood for him. Not because he asked for it, but because they owed it. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often in the quietest places, not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.